My sister passed away, leaving me 250 acres of vineyards, 400 head of cattle, and a classic Cadillac. After 8 years of silence, my daughter suddenly appeared in high heels, declaring, "I'm here to help manage everything." But the moment my lawyer walked in with 2 deputies, she quickly backed away, 3 steps in a row. At my sister's funeral, my daughter Vanessa publicly humiliated me. She stood in front of everyone and shouted that I had no right to the 250-acre vineyard, the 400 head of cattle, the vintage Cadillac, or the $1.8 million Lydia Monroe left to me. 8 years ago, Vanessa cut me out of her life because I refused to fund her husband's failing business. That day, she turned her back on me. But this time, in front of 100 witnesses, she tried to erase me again. I froze, caught in the shame, but a new resolve stirred inside me. What came next would make her regret ever underestimating me. I didn't say a word when she called me a parasite. Not when her voice bounced off the high church ceiling. Not when a woman in the front row gasped. Not even when I saw Samuel lower his head in disbelief. I just stood there. My sister's casket was still at the altar, surrounded by lilies and a photograph of her in her garden hat, laughing. Lydia Monroe, owner of a sprawling vineyard, a herd of cattle, a classic Cadillac, and millions in cash, had left it all to me. But that didn't matter to Vanessa. My daughter hadn't spoken to me in 8 years, not since I refused to give her husband $30,000 for a business scheme that was clearly doomed. When I said no, she told me I had failed her as a mother, and then she disappeared. Now, in front of mourners, vineyard workers, and even a reporter like Clara with her discreet camera, Vanessa was staging a public execution. "This woman is not entitled to anything," she yelled. "She doesn't deserve the land. She never helped Aunt Lydia. She doesn't know the first thing about wine or cattle." She didn't stop. Her words hit me like fists. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't ask her to stop. Underneath the shame and the heat climbing up my neck, I felt something solid, like armor. It had been growing for years, ever since her father, Richard, had convinced her I was the enemy. And now it was here, fully formed, as Vanessa tried to tear me down. After her outburst, the room fell into a heavy, waiting silence. The priest was speechless. People avoided my gaze. A few offered weak smiles, but most looked away. Samuel, Lydia's vineyard manager of 25 years, stepped beside me. "Let's sit," he whispered, placing a gentle hand on my elbow. But I shook my head. I wanted to feel the sting. Let her finish, I thought. Let her bleed out every last drop of venom. Let everyone hear it. Because the moment she stopped screaming, I knew the silence that followed would belong to me. When the service ended, I stayed behind. I watched the last of the crowd drift out. Vanessa didn't even look at me. She left with her lawyer. No tears, no backward glance at the casket. I walked up to Lydia's photograph and straightened the frame. Her eyes were crinkled in that way they always were when she caught me eating grapes straight off the vine. I whispered, "I heard you, Lydia. I know what you wanted, and I won't let her touch it." Out in the gravel lot, reporters hesitated. I kept walking. Clara gave me a small nod, and something in her face told me the world had seen what happened in that church, and they would remember. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table in the old cottage behind the vineyard house. It was the same table Lydia and I used to eat toast at as kids, waiting for the sun to come up so we could run through the vines barefoot. Now it was covered in legal folders. Maxwell Thornton, Lydia's attorney, arrived promptly at 7. He was calm, almost cold. "Harriet," he said as he opened his briefcase, "I'm here to formally read your sister's will, as per her wishes. This process will be private, with just you present. No drama." He read the final line. "All land, assets, livestock, personal property, and cash holdings are hereby transferred in full to my sister, Harriet Monroe. I entrust her to preserve this land, as I know she carries its roots in her bones." My breath caught. Maxwell handed me a sealed envelope. I recognized Lydia's handwriting instantly. I'll read it later, I told him. He nodded. We have a lot to review, but know this, your sister made everything legally airtight. She anticipated resistance. I gave a dry, hollow laugh. I already felt the first wave this morning. Maxwell paused. That wasn't the last. He left the folder on the table, tipped his hat, and disappeared into the night. I stayed at the papers. It didn't feel like a victory yet, but the shaking had stopped, and that was a start. The next morning began with dust and silence. I was already up when Samuel arrived, just after 6. He brought black coffee and 2 croissants. We didn't speak much. We sat on the back porch, watching the fog roll off the fields. Lydia's land. My land now. Samuel broke the silence first. She meant every word in that will, Harriet. I hope you know that. I nodded once. The quiet between us was comfortable. I spent the rest of the morning at Lydia's old desk, sorting through the folders Maxwell had left, titles, deeds, insurance policies, ranch hand names, vendor lists. The paperwork had a clarity to it, a structure, unlike the chaos Vanessa had thrown into the church. By noon, I was at the vineyard office with Maxwell and Lydia's accountant. The transfer is complete, Maxwell said. All holdings are in your name as of this morning. I signed the final page and closed the folder. I assume your daughter has not reached out, he said. Not a word. He gave a tight nod. Then be prepared for the next stage. She won't go quietly. I leaned back in the chair. I don't expect her to. She did not disappoint. That evening, a courier arrived with a packet of legal documents. I opened them alone in the kitchen, standing by the sink. Demand for immediate reconsideration of will execution. Petition to delay asset transfer. Motion to freeze estate distribution. All of it was signed by her attorney and all of it was aggressive. Vanessa was never subtle. I called Maxwell. She's trying to freeze everything. He didn't hesitate. I'll file the response before midnight. She has no standing. No history of support or contribution. Just noise. Still, it lit something in me. I walked past the old irrigation shed and down the dirt path Lydia and I used to walk every spring, back when we'd dream about what the land could become, and when I thought Vanessa might be a part of it. That dream was long gone. The vineyard was mine now, and with it came the burden of defending what Lydia had trusted me with. The next day, Vanessa arrived in person. She didn't call ahead or knock. I saw her through the kitchen window, standing at the front steps in black slacks and a wine-colored blazer. Her hair and expression were tight. I opened the door and said nothing. She stepped inside like she owned the air, looking around with mock disappointment. Still the same curtains. Still smells like wet books and regret. I closed the door behind her. You think this is over? She asked. You think a signature and a letter from a dead woman can erase everything I've done for this family? I crossed my arms. 8 years, Vanessa. You've been gone for 8 years. You never called. Not once. She smiled, slow and bitter. You think I needed to call? I was out building something real. I let the silence settle. She paced the room as if presenting to a jury. My husband and I built something from nothing. We just needed one push. You turned your back on us. I said nothing. So now, she said, you're going to fix that. You're going to sign over half the land. Not all, just half. That's fair. And the cattle. I know a guy who can take the herd off your hands for a good price. You wouldn't even have to lift a finger. I didn't move. She pulled papers from her bag. My voice was calm. No. She blinked. Excuse me. No, I repeated, her jaw locked. I gave you a chance to do this the easy way. I stepped forward. You gave me nothing. You walked away. You erased me. And now you're standing in my sister's house asking me to give you what she left behind. I watched her face shift from anger to calculation. She softened her tone. Mom, let's not fight. We can work together. You don't have the background to run this place. I can help. I took the papers from her hand, walked to the fireplace, and dropped them in. She stared at the flames as they caught. Then she turned and walked out. No threats, no yelling. But I knew it wasn't over. That woman wasn't my daughter anymore. She was a storm coming, and I was done seeking shelter. 2 days passed before her next move. I spent those days walking the vineyard with Samuel, reviewing harvest schedules and distribution contracts. There was comfort in the rhythm of it, the hum of bees, the steady pace of boots on soil, the smell of ripe fruit. The land was honest, even if the people around it were not. Samuel didn't ask about Vanessa. We both knew something was brewing. On the third morning, Eleanor Price showed up at my door with a paper bag of peaches and a frown. She was direct, sharp, and loyal. We'd met in college and reconnected years later. She set the bag on the table and pulled out her phone. "You need to see this." She showed me a screenshot of a blog post with my name in the headline. "Local retiree inherits vineyard, freezes out real A." It had a grainy photo of me outside the courthouse, head down, sunglasses on, the kind of image used to suggest guilt. It was a slick mix of half-truths, painting me as greedy, a manipulator who exploited a dying sister's mental decline. None of it was true, and all of it was intentional. I didn't speak for a while. I read the whole thing twice, then set the phone down. "She wants a war," I said. Eleanor nodded slowly. "And she wants to win it in the court of public opinion before the law catches up." Later that afternoon, I found Samuel in the equipment shed. I handed him the phone. He read the article without a word. "She's going for your throat," he said, handing it back. "Let her." His eyes held mine. "Are you sure?" I was, because I could see it clearly now. Vanessa wasn't here for family or memory or control. She was here for liquidation. She wanted to chop Lydia's life into pieces and sell it. She wanted the money in her account, the cattle on a truck, the vines under contract to some private equity firm that would squeeze the land until it broke. She didn't care about what was built. She cared about what could be sold. That night, Maxwell came by with the final trust statements and a printed copy of the blog post. "This came from her husband's marketing firm," he said. I traced the domain. Of course, she hadn't just decided to attack. She had prepared for it. Maxwell tapped his folder. "Her attorney has filed another motion, this one requesting an emergency hearing to challenge the will. I'll handle it, but I want you to be ready." "I am," I said. The next morning, Vanessa returned. No warning. I heard her voice before I saw her, loud and controlled, as she spoke to one of the ranch hands. "I'm sure you all wondering how long you'll have jobs once my mother cashes out." The man, Jordan, barely 20, looked like he wanted to vanish. Vanessa spotted me, her smile wide, her eyes cold. "Just making sure everyone knows what's coming," she said, climbing the steps. I blocked the doorway. "You've said enough." She tilted her head. "The community deserves the truth." "You don't care about this community. You don't even live here." She stepped back and gestured toward the vines. "And yet I was born here. You raised me here. That should mean something." It did. Once. She saw the steel under the quiet and dropped the next blow. "I've met with investors. 2 serious offers. We can both walk away with what we want. You keep the house and a little land. I take the rest. It's a win-win. You don't want the headache of running this place." I kept my voice steady. "You think money is the goal? It never was." She scoffed. "Then what is this? Pride? Spite?" "No. Legacy." She turned and walked away. Not defeated, just regrouping. That afternoon, Maxwell called again. Her legal team had submitted documents questioning my mental fitness, claiming I was under emotional duress and too old to be trusted with the estate. They attached affidavits from paid experts and distant cousins. The intent was clear. Vanessa wasn't trying to win in court. She was trying to overwhelm and drown me in papers and headlines. She thought I'd fold. She didn't know me at all. I spent the evening rereading Lydia's letter. The ink was dark, the handwriting steady. Lydia had always been deliberate. She wrote that I had always known how to wait, how to endure, that I understood the value of patience and precision. That was the difference between Vanessa and me. Vanessa shouted. I listened. Vanessa grabbed. I watched. She stormed. I endured, but not forever. I folded the letter, set it in the drawer, and turned off the light. The next phase wouldn't be about defense. It would be about exposure. Let her keep talking. I had something else. Truth, proof, and a plan. I met Eleanor at the old cafe. She chose a corner table, her back to the window, her eyes on the door. Years of being a judge had made her alert. She wore no makeup, her silver hair in a knot. Her hands were steady as she poured sugar into her tea. She just waited. I laid the folder on the table. It was light, thin, but felt like granite. She opened it. Photos, emails, a phone transcript. Samuel had helped gather it all. Vanessa had underestimated how many people were loyal to this land. Eleanor scanned the documents in silence. She placed a finger on one email. This is enough to ruin her in court. It wasn't a threat, just a fact. Vanessa had been working with a commercial developer from Nevada to parcel the vineyard into private estates and resorts. The emails revealed her intention to dissolve the foundation Lydia had set up, remove the farmhands, and bulldoze the cottages. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was premeditated. Eleanor closed the folder. You said you didn't want to fight her through the courts. I don't, I said. Then use the court of truth. I nodded. Later that day, I met with Clara Whitmore, the journalist. She hadn't run the funeral footage yet, waiting for the right moment. I told her it was time. I handed her the folder. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the contents. She asked for a quiet room and a few hours. I gave her both. By sunset, she had assembled a report. She showed me the first cut, no music, no edits, just truth layered with more truth. Vanessa yelling at the funeral, documents, voiceovers, screenshots of emails. A clear path from her arrival to her intentions to sell. It was clean, harsh, and honest. I asked her to hold it for one more day. I had my own work to do. That night, I unlocked the small safe Lydia kept in her office. The combination was the same as always. Inside were letters and a digital recorder. I charged the device and played the most recent file. Lydia's voice filled the room. She spoke slowly, carefully. She talked about Vanessa, about her manipulation, and how she had once believed Vanessa would carry the family's legacy. But then she learned otherwise. Lydia spoke of betrayal, of how Vanessa had pressured her to change the will, and how she disappeared when Lydia refused. She closed the message with a sentence that pierced my chest. I'm leaving it all to you, not because you want it, but because you won't sell it. I saved the recording and made 3 backup copies. The next morning, I invited Maya to walk the fields with me. She'd been quiet, keeping her distance. I didn't blame her. She came here to learn about wine, not to get caught in a family war. We walked the rows in silence. The grapes were nearly ready. Finally, she said, I saw the blog post. I didn't believe a word of it. I thanked her. I told her about Lydia's message, the video Clara had built, and the town hall meeting in 2 days. Her eyes lit up. You're going to show it? Yes. The hall was already reserved. Lydia had booked it for the annual appreciation night. Vanessa thought it was cancelled, but I kept the reservation. Now it would be used for something else. The next 48 hours moved fast. Clara polished the report. Maxwell reviewed it for liability. Samuel called in 3 former managers who had been burned by Vanessa's husband's failed business. Eleanor prepared a written statement. I didn't sleep, not from fear, but from clarity. I finally understood what Lydia had known. That silence protects no one. That dignity without action is surrender. The night of the meeting, I arrived daily. I wore dark jeans, a clean white shirt, and Lydia's hat. The seats filled quickly with workers, neighbors, and former staff. Even the mayor showed up. Vanessa walked in 20 minutes late, her heels loud against the floor. She took a seat in the front, crossed her legs, and smiled. She thought this was another attempt at public sympathy. She didn't know the screen behind her would show her own emails. The lights dimmed. Clara stood and introduced the report, stating the facts. The video began. You could hear a pin drop. When it ended, the room was stunned. Then came murmurs, then voices. Samuel stood and spoke. Then Eleanor. Then a field worker who had been there for 21 years. They spoke of integrity and what Lydia had built. Vanessa stood, red-faced, trying to shout over the noise, but no one was listening. I walked to the microphone. I looked out over the room, then at her. You came here for money. I came back for memory. She opened her mouth, but there was nothing left to say. The meeting ended with a symbolic vote. Support for Harriet Monroe as the sole steward of Lydia's estate. Every hand went up, even Maya's. Vanessa walked out alone, and no one followed. The fallout began before the chairs were folded. By the time I got home, Clara's report had been clipped into segments and shared across the county. The clip of Vanessa screaming at the funeral. The email about bulldozing the barn. It was all over social media. I didn't post a word myself. The town did it for me. At sunrise, Samuel texted 2 words. It started. By noon, the wine co-op pulled Vanessa's name from their board. By evening, one of the 2 investors she had mentioned sent a letter to my attorney, withdrawing from all discussions. The silence from her side was telling. For the first time, the pressure shifted. It wasn't just mine to carry. The community had seen and heard. And whether they supported me out of respect, guilt, or clarity, it no longer mattered. The line had been drawn. Eleanor came by the next day with a folder and a firm look. She sat at the table and opened it. I need you to see this. It was a draft of a sales contract Vanessa had never filed. She had intended to hand over 3 parcels of land to a developer. She would not have succeeded, but she had tried, and in writing. The deal fell apart the moment the footage aired, but the document remained. It was enough. Eleanor met my eyes. I've already submitted it to the local land commission. If she tries again, they'll flag it. I closed the folder. It was all beginning to settle. I should have felt relief, but one part was left. Vanessa hadn't left town. She hadn't apologized. She was quiet, which meant she was planning something. That evening, I walked the vineyard with Maya. We walked past the oldest section where Lydia's favorite rose produced sweet fruit. Maya paused. I've never seen a room turn like that. You didn't raise your voice. You just told the truth. I nodded. Lydia used to say, a lie makes noise. Truth does not need to. She smiled and walked ahead, but I stayed back. I had one more thing to do. I returned to the house and opened Lydia's safe. There was one letter I hadn't touched. It was addressed to the foundation board, dated 3 weeks before her death. In it, she stated that Vanessa was not to be included in any decision-making capacity. She had written it as a precaution. Now it was a tool. Maxwell reviewed it that evening and nodded. This makes it airtight. She has no path forward now. The next morning, I drove into town. People looked at me differently, not with pity, but with recognition. The woman at the feed store handed me my receipt and said quietly, "You did good." It was permission to stand tall. When I got home, I found Vanessa's car. She was on the porch swing, arms folded, eyes hard. She didn't rise when I approached. "You humiliated me," she said. I didn't respond. "You made me look like a monster." Still, I said nothing. "You think this is over?" I held her gaze. She blinked first. I could see the crack. She wanted to scream, but she had nothing left to scream about. She had tried everything, and none of it worked. Not because I was stronger, but because she underestimated what it meant to carry history. She stepped off the porch and walked past me. As she reached her car, she turned. "You've ruined everything." Then she got in and drove away. I stood there for a while, not triumphant, not bitter, just still. Inside, I sat at Lydia's desk and wrote a short letter. It thanked the foundation board for their trust, confirmed my intention to honor Lydia's legacy, and enclosed a copy of her final letter. Then I went outside and stood in the sun. The air smelled like soil and grapes. It was the scent of something saved, something earned. The next step was to face the legal consequences of what she tried to do, but that would begin tomorrow. Tonight, I would rest and listen to the vineyard breathing. Because the land, unlike people, never lies. It simply waits to be protected. It began with an envelope from the county office, hand-delivered by a clerk. It contained a formal notice of investigation. The county had launched an internal audit after receiving an anonymous report. The report included documents Eleanor had flagged and footage from Clara's piece. It didn't mention Vanessa's name, but the timeline and references made it clear they were coming for her. I sat at Lydia's desk, feeling no heat in my chest. I had done what needed to be done. Now the weight had shifted. I called Maxwell. They'll ask for your cooperation as a witness. I told him I was ready. That afternoon, I gathered all the original files, emails, copies of the contract, Lydia's voice recording, and the letter to the foundation board. Everything was organized. When Eleanor arrived, the table looked like a courtroom exhibit. She reviewed it all. "Solid," she said, adding her own notes. Meanwhile, word had spread. Clara's news piece had gone national, hitting a nerve about family betrayal and inheritance. A second envelope arrived from the district attorney's office. It stated that a hearing had been set to determine if formal charges could be filed against Vanessa for fraud and attempted misappropriation of trust assets. It was real now. The same afternoon, Vanessa's car disappeared from her rental. I knew she hadn't gone far. Vanessa never ran. She hid and then struck. But this time, the window was closed. Maxwell called me in for a deposition. I wore the same outfit as the town hall and brought the folders. My voice didn't shake. I told the truth. From the funeral to the bulldozers, from Lydia's words to her last wishes, from the whispers to the meeting that flipped everything. I told them about our estrangement and her reappearance only after the estate was announced. The truth carried its own weight. After the deposition, I walked the courthouse steps. The air felt light. I didn't feel victorious, just precise. That evening, Samuel stopped by with news. One of Vanessa's old associates had given a statement to the DA, with emails and voice notes. A second hearing was scheduled, with potential charges now including coercion and falsifying investor documents. The news spread fast. Vanessa's name was being spoken aloud in courtrooms. Maya told me that an association connected to Lydia's work had gathered over 4,000 signatures in 24 hours. People who had never visited the vineyard saw themselves in the story. I stayed out of the comments. I had work to do. The next morning, people came to help with the harvest, old friends of Lydia, former students, even local kids. They came because they knew this land deserved to survive beyond the scandal. I worked beside them, not speaking about Vanessa. Let the courts handle what I had already exposed. That night, I received one final letter from Vanessa's lawyer, a quiet withdrawal of all claims. No apology, no explanation. Just 2 pages of cold legal language. I read it 3 times. Then I placed it beside Lydia's last letter. The contrast said more than any courtroom could. I went to bed early, and for the first time in months, my sleep would not be interrupted by doubt. And outside, the vineyard stood quiet, still mine, still untouched. It was just past 6 a.m. that I, in the twilight, I watched the old white sedan pull onto the gravel lot. I'd been pruning the vines on the south fence, my gloves sticky with sap and dirt. The evening light was a golden hue, making the vine rows glow like candles. The car door shut, not with a bang, but not softly either. She stood at the field's edge, as if unsure of her next move. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, and her face seemed thinner, her cheekbones sharper than I remembered. The suit she wore was stiff, like she had been carrying a heavy weight in its pockets all day. Vanessa didn't speak. She just waited. I peeled off my gloves, put them in my back pocket, and walked through the rows until I was about 10 feet away. The silence wasn't light. It was thick. She met my gaze, and I gave a single nod, a sign of recognition, not welcome or forgiveness. She followed me to the back porch. I didn't invite her in. We sat on 2 chairs facing west, toward the hills. The air was a mix of lavender and dust. I poured us each a glass of water and waited. Vanessa finally spoke. She said she had seen the letter, the official withdrawal. I replied that I had received 2. She said she wasn't here to ask for anything. No appeals, no claims, no dramatic final requests. I nodded again. After a moment, with her fingers gripping the glass, she said she never intended for things to go this far. I didn't respond. She said she just wanted a piece of something, a part of Lydia's legacy she believed she deserved. My face remained calm. I told her that a legacy isn't earned by showing up after the work is done to claim you planted a seed. I turned away, but I didn't soften. I reminded her that she hadn't visited the hospital when Lydia was sick, hadn't called once, hadn't sent flowers or a card. I reminded her that Lydia left the ranch to me not because I asked, but because I stayed. I watered the vines through droughts, fixed fences in the winter, and held her hand when her memory faded. Lydia knew who had roots here, and she made her choice with clarity. Vanessa clenched her jaw but didn't interrupt. She then asked what I wanted from her. It wasn't a question, but a surrender. I told her I wanted nothing. I didn't need her apology, her confession, her tears, or her proof of sorrow. What I needed was silence. I needed distance. I needed this story to end. Vanessa sat perfectly still. I reminded her that her actions weren't just betrayal. They were theft, attempted erasure, and public humiliation. I reminded her that she stood in a church and called her own mother a parasite. I told her she wasn't a victim of a mistake. She was the one who made it. The sun was sinking, casting shadows across her hands as they tightened on the glass. She said she had nothing left, no home, no friends, a gone husband, a suspended job, a stained reputation. She said she was empty. I told her that sometimes being empty is the first step toward becoming someone new. She let out a sound that was a mix of a laugh and a caught breath. She then asked, "Why not fight harder to save us?" I looked toward the vineyard. "Because you started the fire," I said, "and I'm done running into burning buildings for people who lock the door from the inside." Vanessa didn't argue. She sat there quietly, her shoulders slumped, all sharpness gone. Just a woman left with whatever came next. I stood up. She didn't. I said one last thing before going inside. "You're still my daughter. That won't change. But love without respect is a wound we keep pressing on." I walked away without looking back. Inside, I stood at the window and watched her sit alone for a few more minutes. Then she stood slowly, walked to her car, and drove away. No goodbyes, no drama, just an ending. That night, I didn't write anything down. I didn't relive it. I didn't tell Samuel, Eleanor, or Clara. Some things don't need repeating. They need to be closed. I shut the door, poured myself tea, and sat in the quiet of the old cottage, watching the last light fall over the land Lydia left in my hands. I let it fall. The ranch felt different the morning after Vanessa left. Not silent, but quiet, as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted. I woke before sunrise, just like always, but this time I sat on the edge of the bed for a few extra minutes. My hands rested on my knees, and for the first time in years, the usual pressure on my chest was gone. I didn't rush to make coffee. I let the wind carry in the scent of damp earth and crushed lavender. Everything felt lighter, even the dust. I didn't feel like I had won. There was no victory, no applause, no slamming doors. The feeling was more like taking a deep breath after holding it for years, like stepping from darkness into the open air. I ate a simple breakfast on the back porch, toast and eggs, while the wind swirled leaves across the deck. My old dog, Clovis, came and rested his head on my knee. I scratched his ear, and we sat in comfortable silence. I knew the days ahead wouldn't be simple. The wound between Vanessa and me hadn't vanished. It had just been cauterized. It would leave a scar, but it wouldn't fester. For now, that was enough. I spent the morning walking the property. Lydia used to call it touching base with the land. I followed her old paths through the orchard and fields, past the shed where we collected rainwater. I ran my fingers over the wild herbs growing by the fences and stood at the edge of the vineyard, looking at the ancient, thick vines and the young ones we planted last year. I thought about how long it took them to grow, to take root, to bear fruit. There was a quiet honesty in their process. They didn't rush or complain. They simply did what they were meant to do, season after season. I walked past the barn and watched the calves kicking up dirt and snorting. I tossed some hay into their trough and leaned on the gate, watching them settle down. It reminded me that life continues, no matter how dramatic the day before might have been. Around noon, I went inside and opened the big ledger in the kitchen. The first half was in Lydia's handwriting, the second half in mine. Bills still needed to be paid, and accounts had to be balanced. The work of the ranch didn't pause for personal problems. It demanded my attention, and I gave it. But as I worked, my thoughts turned to the future. The ranch had belonged to Lydia, then to me, and soon it would need to belong to someone else. Not just legally, but in spirit, someone who would love it out of genuine reverence, not obligation. That afternoon, I called Eleanor. She answered on the second ring, her steady voice a comfort I didn't know I needed. I asked if she could come by next week to talk. She said she'd bring tea and ginger scones. That evening, I took a wooden box down from the top shelf of my closet. Inside were old photographs, notes from Lydia, and a few pieces of jewelry I hadn't worn in years. I sifted through them slowly, holding each one. A photograph of Lydia and me, laughing on the porch with wine glasses, stopped me. I was in my late 40s. She had just turned 60. I remembered that day. We were dusty and tired, but we laughed like we had discovered something ancient and joyful. The photo reminded me of who we were before the bitterness and accusations, before Vanessa. It showed me that joy had lived here once, wild and free. I lit a candle in the kitchen and left the windows open, letting the wind blow through the house. I wrote in my notebook for the first time in months. I wrote about the weight of silence, the sharpness of memory, and the pain of motherhood. I wrote that forgiveness isn't a gift wrapped in ribbons. It's a slow process that asks only that you stop feeding the fire. I didn't write Vanessa's name. It wasn't needed. Some things are best left unsaid. By the time I went to bed, the candle had almost burned out. The house smelled of cedar and smoke. I closed the windows and checked on Clovis, who was already asleep by the fireplace. I turned off the lights and lay under the quilt, listening to the wind. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was a beginning. The sun rose behind a soft veil of clouds, casting a silver light over the vineyard. I stepped outside with a mug of black coffee, wrapped in my old flannel shawl. The air was still, tasting like change. I had spent the past few days thinking, walking, and listening. Lydia's absence no longer felt like a wound, but a space. And in that space, I realized what I had to do. This land was more than just a memory of her. It was my voice, my way of choosing what my legacy would be now that the old scripts were gone. So I dressed, not in jeans or mud boots, but in slacks and a crisp blouse, and drove to town. The tires hummed a steady, grounding rhythm against the road. I didn't tie in on the radio. My first stop was the attorney's office. Eleanor met me at the door and led me into the same conference room where I had been handed Lydia's will, trembling. This time, I was the one holding papers. I handed her a folder with new instructions. I told her I would keep the house, vineyard, and cattle until I passed. But I wanted to create something bigger than a simple inheritance. I wanted a community endowment in Lydia's name, a trust that would offer grants, mentorship, and legal support for women over 50 restarting their lives after loss or betrayal. Eleanor leaned back, reading the documents. She said very little at first, just a few clarifying questions. I explained I didn't want it to be a flashy charity, This was about control and clarity, about protecting someone I loved even after she was gone. Then I added a clause: Vanessa would receive nothing. Not out of anger, but because I was finally done compromising my worth. When Eleanor nodded and agreed to begin drafting the documents, I simply thanked her, folded my shawl over my arm, and left. Next, I went to the vineyard office and called a staff meeting. Just 7 people, some who had worked with Lydia for decades, others newer. Their faces held a mix of expectation and exhaustion. I told them the ranch would continue as always, that no one was losing their job. But I was also introducing a new line of business: weekend training programs on sustainable agriculture and wine production for women over 50. Some faces lit up, others looked confused. I didn't go into details, leaving room for their unasked questions, and ended the meeting. I returned home and moved through the house with new purpose. In the guest room, I packed up the floral bedding Vanessa had chosen and replaced it with Lydia's quilt. In the hallway, I took down the wedding photo of Vanessa and Todd, replacing it with pictures of harvest days, of Lydia smiling among grape crates. In my office, I pulled out the old tin box of letters from Vanessa. I reread a few, some affectionate, some bitter. Then I sealed them in a manila envelope, wrote her name on the front, and placed it on the top shelf of the closet. I didn't throw it away. I just put it out of reach. The next day, I started making calls. I called Alma Vasquez, a woman I'd met through Lydia who was widowed at 58 with a mountain of debt. She had since built a successful jam business. I invited her to lunch. I also called Jeanette Waller, a former high school teacher who had experience in adult education. I asked if she would be interested in designing workshops for the ranch. By the end of the week, I had 6 women lined up for the first evening session. I sat on the front porch with a glass of Lydia's Merlot. The sky was burning gold behind the hills, and the vines swayed slightly in the wind, like women sharing secrets. I wasn't trying to build an empire. I was simply trying to root myself in something honest. Just as the sun was setting, a car pulled up. It was Todd. He got out, dressed in pressed slacks and a navy shirt, walking with the confidence of a man who still believed charm could fix anything. I stayed in my chair. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets. He said Vanessa wanted to talk, that she regretted how things went, and that she felt hurt and abandoned, claiming the money wasn't the real issue. I didn't move. I told him Vanessa had chosen her silence a long time ago, before Lydia even died. I wasn't going to crawl over broken glass to reach a hand that only pointed blame. I told him the estate had been restructured. He flinched, then smiled, and said he understood. I let him leave with that smile. It was the last thing I owed him. That night, I wrote again, not about Vanessa, but about Lydia and what it means to protect something after it's gone. About how sometimes the greatest power isn't revenge, but reinvention. And for the first time, the page didn't shake under my hand. It held firm, just like the land. It began with whispers. A woman at the farmer's market told me she had seen a flyer for the vineyard workshops and had always wanted to learn how to graft vines but thought she was too old. Another woman, younger, said she heard about Lydia Monroe's ranch being used for some kind of secret training program. I smiled and kept walking, but inside I felt the current shifting. The seed I had planted was growing faster than I imagined. But it was the phone call from Jeanette that told me everything was about to change. She said a woman named Trisha Barnes had shown up to the info session, referred by someone named Vanessa, who was now calling herself a consultant. She said Vanessa was taking credit for the entire program. I sat very still. I didn't raise my voice or say her name out loud. I simply asked Jeanette to forward me the materials, the flyers, the emails. And there it was, my daughter's name stamped across the bottom of a glossy brochure, Vanessa Monroe, Strategic Community Development Advisor. She had written herself back into the story, but this time she wasn't trying to rewrite me. She was trying to take credit for what I had built. I didn't call her. Instead, I met with Eleanor. She didn't say, "I told you so," or raise an eyebrow. She just listened, took notes, and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were copies of the flyers, email threads from participants, and social media screenshots. Proof that Vanessa had misrepresented herself as a co-founder of the Monroe Women's Trust and had taken funds from at least 4 attendees for early access mentorship. Eleanor said one word: fraud. Then she asked what I wanted to do, and I told her. 2 days later, Eleanor sent a cease and desist letter to Vanessa's attorney. 2 days after that, we filed a formal complaint with the state. The workshop funds were frozen, and a temporary injunction was placed on Vanessa's consulting activities using our name. And just like that, the mirror cracked. I heard about it first from Todd. He showed up again, looking a mess. His eyes were bloodshot, and his shirt was wrinkled. He didn't come inside, just stood on the porch and mumbled that things had gotten complicated. He said Vanessa was spiraling and blaming me for everything. I told him to leave, but before he turned away, I said one last thing. Tell her I'm done protecting her from the truth. He didn't reply. He just walked back to his car, slower than before. Within a week, word spread. Local business owners who had supported the workshops began to distance themselves from Vanessa. A small article in the regional paper detailed how she had used the Monroe name for personal gain. When a few women backed out of the upcoming sessions, worried about being tied to the scandal, I wasn't mad. I was just tired. It was a deep kind of tired, not the kind a good night's sleep can fix. It came from holding on to too many stories that never got told. So, I decided to tell mine. With Eleanor's help, we published a simple open letter in the Sunday paper. There was no drama, no blame, just the truth. I explained how the ranch came into my hands, that Lydia left it to me as a reminder of who I used to be, not just as a piece of property. I shared what the trust was truly for and that it would continue with or without the approval of those who once shared my blood. The next Sunday, I hosted the first Community Harvest Day. 32 women showed up. We walked through the rose garden, laughed, pulled grapes, and ate sandwiches under the oak trees. Some cried, most smiled. That night, I sat in my usual chair on the porch, watching the horizon. The sky was filled with stars, and the air smelled like earth and wine. Then I heard footsteps, not the nervous shuffle of Todd or the precise clicks of Eleanor's heels. This was a slow, steady walk. I knew it was Vanessa before I even turned. She stood at the bottom of the steps, her pale hair pulled back, not in silk or pearls, but in a t-shirt and jeans. She didn't speak right away, and I didn't push her to. Finally, she said she hadn't meant for things to go so far, that she just wanted to feel useful again, and that she didn't know how to ask for help without making it about herself. I listened, then told her that this wasn't about being useful or about forgiveness. It was about boundaries. I wished her healing but made it clear it wouldn't be in my house, on my land, or in my name. She nodded, her eyes wet, but she didn't beg or plead. She just turned and walked away. For the first time in years, I didn't watch her leave with a broken heart. I watched her leave with peace. That night, I opened Lydia's old journal and wrote one last line beneath her final entry. We come from the earth. We return to it, but in between, we must learn to root ourselves in truth. Then, I slept without dreams. After months of careful work, the vines were coming back to life. The vineyard looked less like a wound and more like a body healing. The branches reached toward the light with a quiet confidence. Some mornings, I'd just stand on the patio with my coffee and watch the fog rise over the fields. The peace was almost unsettling, but I welcomed it. There was no ceremony when I fully took over the trust. It wasn't marked by a headline or plaque. The change happened in quiet gestures, a woman in her 60s dropping off a letter asking to volunteer, a high school girl asking about mentorship, a retired professor wanting to teach workshops on self-reliance. It all came in slowly, gently, like a soft rain you don't notice until the ground is no longer hard beneath your feet. Jeanette became my right hand without us ever saying so. She stopped calling me Miss Monroe. We redesigned the courses, added a monthly open circle for women to share their stories, and replaced long intake forms with conversations. One afternoon, Jeanette brought me a wrapped box. Inside was a simple wooden sign with a name we'd only said aloud once before, the Lydia Monroe Women's Circle. I didn't cry, but I felt a tension I didn't know I was still carrying loosened in my chest. We hung the sign by the barn entrance. No announcement, no ribbon, just there, waiting. By late April, the ranch was no longer just mine. It had a new rhythm. People would show up on Saturdays with pies, jam, or folding chairs and leave with plant clippings, advice, or a comforting hand on their shoulder. No one asked who owned what, and no one asked about Vanessa. I stopped offering answers. The Cadillac still sat under the carport. Some days I thought about selling it, others about restoring it and repainting it Lydia's favorite hunter green. But mostly, I just left it there, a relic, a reminder. Eleanor still visited, though less often. She'd taken on more pro bono work, saying that helping women reclaim their assets had become personal for her. One afternoon, as we walked the perimeter of the vineyard, she said she hadn't expected things to settle so fast. I told her it wasn't about speed. It was about choosing stillness over chaos, letting the noise bane itself out while you keep planting. She nodded, and we walked in comfortable silence. Around that time, an old friend of Lydia's reached out. Miriam, who had co-managed a small winery with her, sent a letter. She had been following the news and had a piece of land in Mendocino she no longer needed. She said she'd rather pass it on to someone with calloused hands than another faceless developer. I took the train up. Miriam, in her 80s, had sharp eyes and a no-nonsense voice. But as she showed me the dormant vines, the broken fence, and the creek, I saw a ghost of Lydia standing beside her. We didn't shake hands. She just handed me a folder with the deed and said, "Make something honest out of it." By the end of the month, the trust had its first satellite site, smaller, with harsher soil, but real. News of it didn't travel far, but in our corner of the world, it was enough. A few women from the original group volunteered to help restore it, and Jeanette handled the early details. I drove back and forth twice a week, wearing gloves that had once been Lydia's. I didn't talk much during those drives. I just breathed. In those moments, I didn't feel like someone who had been betrayed or left. I felt like someone who had planted herself again. Evenings on the main ranch grew quieter. The volunteers would leave, Jeanette would head home, and the dogs would curl up at my feet. I'd sit with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the last bit of light fade. Sometimes I'd write, not in Lydia's journal, but in a new one. I didn't document the drama. I wrote about soil types, root growth, and the way women's faces looked when they smiled with both grief and relief. I wrote about starting over, not as a grand gesture, but as 1,000 small, solitary choices. It wasn't forgiveness. It was presence, the kind that doesn't demand to be seen, just felt. The ranch became quieter, and I became louder in other ways. Not by shouting, but through ownership, clarity, and a silence that was no longer empty, but full. By the end of the season, I had started planning something new. Not a class, not a workshop, but a legacy. That's for another chapter. Summer rolled in, quiet and warm. The vineyard hummed in the heat, and bees drifted lazily around the lavender. For the first time in years, I felt no need to prove anything, not to Vanessa, not to Lydia's memory, not even to myself. I had already done it. The trust was no longer just a legal structure. It had grown into something living. Every week, women came to the ranch with different stories and different wounds. They worked the land not just to harvest grapes, but to reclaim their value. I saw it in small moments. A woman who once spoke in a whisper now laughing by the barn, a grandmother teaching a younger woman how to check a rootstock. These moments told me more than any headline or financial report ever could. There was no announcement the day the final deed was signed. I walked into the local registrar's office, sat across from a clerk who looked barely old enough to drink, and signed over the Mendocino property to the trust, now officially named the Lydia Monroe Foundation for Women Reclaiming Their Lives. Just ink and silence, no red tape, no cameras. I didn't tell Vanessa. I didn't need to. She had disappeared from the news cycle. Her name no longer appeared in my search alerts. Whatever money she thought she'd get from tearing me down had vanished the moment I refused to let her control the story. And that was enough for me. I had no interest in her apology or reconciliation. I had made peace with silence, a different kind of silence than before. This was one I chose, born from clarity, ownership, and purpose. Some evenings, I'd drive the Cadillac along the back roads. I'd roll down the windows and just listen to the wind rustling the fields, the tires humming on the pavement, and my own breathing. That was enough. One Sunday in mid-August, Jeanette brought her 8-year-old daughter, Nova. She was bright-eyed with wild hair and boots that were too big for her. Nova ran up to me with a purple notebook and asked if she could plant her own vine. I nodded without a word. We walked past the barn to the richest soil in the vineyard. Nova knelt and pressed her hands into the dirt like it was a secret. She dug a small hole, placed her seedling gently, and whispered something I couldn't hear. When she looked up, she gave me a full-toothed smile. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Today, a little girl named Nova planted her future beside mine," and it was enough. In the days that followed, we prepared for the first annual gathering. Women from all over the region came, some with their daughters, others alone. We had music, simple food, and shared stories by the fire. When it was my turn to speak, I stood in front of them, looking out at the vineyard bathed in amber light, and said one sentence: "This land was once a battlefield. Now it's a table, and there's room for every one of you." I didn't cry. I didn't need to. They understood. By the end of the night, the barn was filled with laughter, not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that rises from it. I never saw Vanessa again. I don't know if she ever healed or if she ever looked back and saw the damage she left behind. But I stopped needing answers. I stopped needing anything from someone who had once chosen to leave. The life I rebuilt wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of refusal. I refused to carry her hatred. I refused to inherit her silence. I refused to let her define my last chapter. And now, I'm writing my own. So, if you ever find yourself abandoned or discarded by the people you once called family, remember this: silence can be survival, but rebuilding is power. I rebuilt, not to prove a point, but to plant a future. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear it. Have you ever been pushed aside by those you love most, only to find a strength they never imagined? Thanks for watching. Take care. Good luck.